Hey everybody, it's David Griscom here, doing another one of these live streams. We've been saying we're going to try to do more of them and keep everybody, keep connected with everybody in this time where it feel like we're very much disconnected. I'm hoping my mic and stuff is all good. I'm pretty sure it is, but I always want to make sure. But yeah, so these. I like to keep them, usually I try to have a theme that I'm going to go through, but, this is interactive. So for sure, jump in with questions and comments and things that you're thinking about. And I'm just going to start to break down some of the ideas that I'm, that I'm sort of working through. It's really nice to be able to get that direct feedback and try to, think things through together. And also happy Juneteenth. It's it's a beautiful day here in Brooklyn, and I hope it is wherever y'all are, and you're able to celebrate and participate as much as you can. It's definitely a very inspiring time, to be around. As we were saying on Tuesday, there's a moment when this COVID crisis happened when it felt like history was really stopping, and there wasn't going to be a lot of room for politics. But that's sure been shown wrong, and unfortunately, it's had to come out of such tragic circumstances. But people are out there fighting and really making a change. So it's something that's very inspiring to see and be able to be a part of it, as much as we're able to. So again, we've been continuing to grow the channel, and as y'all saw on Tuesday, we had a pretty big guest in Noam Chomsky. And we couldn't do that without all of your support. So, if you haven't already, seriously consider becoming a patron. That's how we keep everything going and are able to put in the kind of work that has really been able to develop into a show that I think is a very important place for a lot of crucial left-wing ideas that have been sort of ignored, in the mass media, and also even sort of within like left independent media. We're trying to build a really strong, but also coherent left-wing politics that's very much focused on winning over the people rather than just sort of walling ourselves off into a very specific clique. So again, thanks y'all for coming by. Definitely, jump in there with super chats, and we can, start having a conversation. But yeah, I want to talk about this idea that I've been toying around with. The idea, something I'm going to call left-pessimism, and I might, revamp that concept or what I want to describe. But left-pessimism is something that I think is very prevalent on the left, especially historically. And I think that its origins really do begin in the kind of overall weakness of the American and also European left, when people really felt that there weren't a lot of options, but they were also watching, a world implode around them. And left pessimism, let's give it its due, is an ideology, I think, that comes out of a deep place of caring, right, about the world and what's going on, and being very frustrated that things aren't being done about it. So actually, we'll move backwards to what my theory of left pessimism is, and let me give you an example. So this was a while back, but last year in the UK, if y'all remember, Extinction Rebellion, this massive climate change anti-climate change organization was trying to raise awareness and trying to force a political solution to the massive problem of climate change. So you have Extinction Rebellion, which became a very large-scale movement, and very decentralized. So a lot of people are under the banner of an organization, and not necessarily everything is being voted on by the membership. Even though that was like what people were trying to build up, there are a lot of people who are just going out and saying, "I'm part of XR and I'm doing this." So there was an action last year in Canning Town Station, and I'm sorry for my friends from the UK if I'm getting that wrong. But it was an early morning, around like 5 or 6 a.m. and there's a mass of people trying to get onto the trains to go into the city to work, right? If you've ever been in a major city, you know what that experience is like. Just everyone's standing shoulder to shoulder, heads down. People are, tired. They don't want to have to go in and do a full days of work. They're already up before the sun. But this was a pretty different day for most of them because their trains were delayed, and they were delayed by a couple of men who jumped on top of the trains wearing Extinction Rebellion insignia, like, I don't know, cardboard boxes or something around them, and basically said, "We need to act about climate change. We need to do something about it." And, the crowd reacts in anger. as you would expect, right? Because they're just trying to get to work on the trains, by the way, not driving their cars even. They're trying to get to work, they're tired, they're exhausted, and these people basically are jumping in front of them and stopping them from getting into work. And if you watch the video, we did this on the show. Again, this was like maybe last September of 2019. And if you watch the video, basically, like the crowd all joins together and they pull these guys off of the train. And it's really sad to watch, because you can understand what the guys on top of the train were like wanting, or like their idea was like, I got to do something, the globe is on fire, and if we don't interrupt our day-to-day lives, we're not going to be able to solve the problem of a climate crisis. But that was the worst way to go about that action. Not only was it confusing, because we're all supposed to think that taking the trains, public transportation, is supposed to be an important way to help the environment, but two, you're coming after the wrong people. You're coming after like working class people who are having to show up to their, or having to leave to commute at 6 in the morning. These aren't the people who are preventing meaningful climate action. And so that was it was a bad action, right? It was a bad action. You were putting these two people were putting themselves against the working class and people who are just trying to go to work. And like that's just something that most people can understand. But I wanted to sort of tease that out, because that's what gets into what I call left-pessimism. So an idea like that, like let's just sort of work through what the idea of that action would be, right? So the people are basically just walking around with their heads down. They don't know what's going on, and they just need to be woken up by some big spectacle. That's like old school, like lots of left-wing cultural theorists and philosophers and artists have always had this idea, right? That the problem isn't like capitalism or these large structures or a lack of organization. It's just that the people need some big event, and then everyone's going to say, oh, I understand now, and I'm going to rise up against my oppressor. Well, that's never been how actions come into place, right? There are moments when you see something and you feel like you need to act, right? That happened in the Russian Revolution, when police were firing against, a riot, a protest about the lack of affordable bread for people like that, right? That was a moment that spurred everything, but it was a moment that was very clear. You have the state apparatus, the police, and you had working and hungry people demanding food and being met with bullets, right? So like, I'm not saying that like big moments don't play a role in sort of activating political action. But what happened there is you had political organizations, social organizations that were able to take a field and enact it politically. So left pessimism is not that. Left pessimism is a very pessimistic way of looking at everyone around you, right? It's a despair. It's a philosophy. It's a political ideology of despair about the world around you. Despair about the world around you, and so despair around the world around you, despair about history, despair about the forces that have done all this horror and are continuing to do this horror, and this realization that you can't do anything about the past, you can't undo the history that was done, and you have a serious pessimism about anything good happening in the future. So left pessimism, comes from a place of saying the world's messed up, I feel really bad about this, and that's important in human emotion, but it goes and trails off into this really bad ideology that basically becomes anti-human, anti-action, right? Because instead of saying, okay, well, we need to organize, we need to enact ourselves into a kind of political party, political organization, it's to just say, well, people are all stupid. And look at all these, like little piggies around me, like watching television and eating fast food. I'm sure you've all met people who talk like that, right? Like they have a kind of sympathy with the wickedness around them, but they actually have no sympathy or even like human understanding of like the victims of capitalism, the victims of this society. Those people, the vast majority of us are just trying to live normal lives of dignity, and this kind of like attack against them because they're not these kind of like radicalized subjects, it leads you down a dark place of sort of actually like really doubting the possibility and the potential of humanity, which is an anti-socialist philosophy. Socialism is about the fundamental belief in people and in our power and in the righteousness of us taking power and ruling ourselves collectively, right? So left pessimism comes from, it's a loneliness. It's individualistic philosophy. It's, I got this, I understand the world, nobody else does, so I'm going to retreat, either, completely cut myself off and just sort of be, content, or not even content if you've talked to folks like that, but I'm just going to be happy that I have the proper analysis. Or this other idea that like, oh, well, what the people need is, they need some kind of big spectacle for them to understand and rise up. So that was a pretty, that was a bad action. And this left pessimism, it starts to trickle down into a lot of our political activities. And it's the complete opposite of the attitude that we need to have. And just for folks who are just joining, so this is like a good Q&A, so feel free to jump in. Definitely, if you can send us super chats, we really appreciate that. That also makes it a lot easier for me to see it. And just so you know, it's like we are constantly trying to figure out ways to make this platform work so that we're able to support all the people who work on the show, both like the crew and then all the people who work behind the scenes doing video editing and things like that. We don't really, YouTube really does not give us a lot of ads, basically, because of our content. So anything that you can send help, and definitely check us out on Patreon as well, because that really helps us continue to do the show and let us have these important conversations. But so we have this left pessimism, right? Which is, anyways, this is a concept I'm sort of working out what its role is, but it definitely comes, I think it's a lot stronger before this kind of radical movement. That's an interesting question, Dante. I'm going to jump into that in 1 second. Let me just set this left pessimism up for folks who just joined, because we had a lot more people come in. So left pessimism is this idea that, it starts from a good place of being upset about what's going on around you in the world, but it starts to slide into an anti-human mentality, because you start to say, like, well, nobody's doing anything, nobody cares. It's because everyone has something wrong with their spirit or something wrong with their soul or their morality, that they can't realize that everything's wrong around them. And a lot of it focuses so much on consumer culture and like, oh, look at these, oh yeah, I feel bad for working class people exploited, but look what they do. They go to McDonald's, that kind of attitude that's really nasty. But there's different degrees of it. But that's an ideology that has been very prevalent on the US left, and it was really prevalent before. Sorry, a comrade just texted me. Before we got to the kind of hopeful moments that we had over the past decade, where a lot of people thought, okay, politics can do something, politics can change my life. So left pessimism is this like really pernicious idea that's been sort of hanging around the left, and it bubbles up every once in a while. And I just really want to hit as hard as I can to make sure that people understand that is the bad ideology. That is something we need to defeat. We need to understand. We need to have an optimism and a belief in ourselves and in our comrades that we have the potential to win. That doesn't mean that we are going to, because it's really difficult to build the kind of political movements that we need. But you have to start from a place of that, radical optimism. So let me start up with Dante, who says, do you consider third worldism left pessimism? And for people who don't know third worldism, it's essentially the idea is that within the capitalist core, it's like, so like Lenin had his theory of imperialism, that you need to actually strike where imperialism is weakest, right? Instead of where it's strongest. So that's why Lenin was like, okay, Russia is ripe for revolution, because there's capitalism and there's imperialism in the society, but it hasn't taken root, right? It hasn't developed enough, that it's actually quite weak here. And I think it's definitely clear that Lenin was absolutely right, that there is an advantage to fighting in countries where capitalism and imperialism were very underdeveloped, right? Because you don't have those kind of social structures that people can retreat so easily into in a revolutionary situation. Now, third worldism there's different like tenets and tendencies within it, but I think the way that most people use it online today, because that's also the thing too, it's like a subcultural online movement now too, which is almost separate from the actual historical theory, which is the idea that within the core countries, essentially the United States and Western European capitalist democracies, you're not going to be able to have a revolution there. So what needs to happen is for radicals and revolutionaries to spend all their time supporting radical revolutionary movements in the third world, so that they basically create a bloc that surrounds the capitalist core, so that the capitalist core, United States and Western Europe essentially, would just be completely surrounded by communist countries until they eventually fall. And look, I think that is I think the real lesson is to take that Lenin was right. That there's a lot of potential in countries, where capitalism is not as developed. I'm sorry, I lost the Q&A stuff. Let me see what I did. Here we go. Sorry. So anyways, Lenin's right that like in those countries where capitalism is not as developed, you have the potential. You have a lot of potential. I had a really great professor who was Iranian in college, and he always said like we always had to be Leninists, because only Leninism is an ideology or of the Marxist tradition at that time was the only one that actually said you could be in a third world country and you could fight back and you could create a socialist state, because a lot of the older Western European Marxists would only say only in Germany, only in these established countries can we have this. So I think the point there is that Leninism is correct actually in its argument that you can have revolutions in countries that aren't fully developed capitalist countries. Third worldism, I think there is a pessimism in it when it comes to, especially like the Western variants of third worldism, that we're not going to support labor movements in our own country. We're not going to support socialist parties even in our own country because we're just giving up and say that it's impossible to win here. Yeah, I think that is a pessimism. I think it shares. I bet there's a good crossover between the two, and I'm still working on my theory of left pessimism. So Greg asked, have you seen Irami Osi Frimpong on sexual assault and feminism? No, I haven't. I'm not familiar with what that is, but I guess I can check that out. Let me see. We have a couple other super chats here. Crazy Musician 13 says, love you, Griscom. Any comment on folks who just want to focus on police brutality as opposed to building a sustainable organization for continued action? Well, I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now is that policing hits on so many different issues within our community. I think that's why political strategies, including saying things like hashtag defund the police, are the way to go about the argument. Because I like the way that your question is phrased, and the way that I can see that playing out, for example, online or even in a person-to-person debate, would be like, are we making a choice between talking about policing or talking about capitalism? And that's how we can get lost, right? The point is to find something, a signifier, an idea that unites those struggles. So like defund the police is a phenomenal one for that, because when you say defund the police, and the question is like, okay, well, what does that look like? And then you say, well, neoliberalism has completely gutted social spending. It's hard, it's ruined our communities, our schools are underfunded, and now they're over-policed, basically to make up for the fact that all these schools are underfunded, right? Then you're actually able to, through the demand of saying we want to do something about the police, then build a political movement that is actually going to encompass larger systemic issues. So I think as like radicals and leftists, like that's the way that we need to be engaging with these kind of politics, instead of getting into the kind of argument that's going to be divisive because it's murky and unclear. It's not even divisive as a strategy. It's just like if you go in there with two concepts that are going to be hard to pick one or the other, right? Because if you say like, oh, well, should we focus on police brutality or should we focus on everything? Well, you're going to get lost in that conversation. You can't thread that needle, versus saying, okay, the demand is we need to do something about the police, and then saying, here's some answers about what we can do about that. They are going to touch on a lot of things. I think that's how we're going to build. In Perfish 23, I said compassion, community, and being clear on what can be achieved, and gaining wins via our organization's friendships and networking are also vital. I think That's 100% true, and I think that's what what I'm trying to get to with left pessimism as an idea, because left pessimism, I focused a lot on sort of like what it does to people personally, but like let's think structurally about where that developed. It developed in social networks that have become increasingly atomized. In many cases, people are only speaking to two or three folks who share their beliefs, and in many cases, nobody. And that's because neoliberalism completely destroyed the public. It destroyed the social, and it really tried to turn you into an individual in the purest sense, in the sense that you are cut off from everybody else, and the only way that you're interacting with the rest of the world is through abstraction. And I think like left pessimism as a philosophy, where it originates, really thrives and survives in that space, in that that neoliberalism wrought on us, where people were just completely disconnected from one another, that it becomes a philosophy of individualism, right? Because it only, it starts with yourself saying I'm right and everyone else is wrong. That's left pessimism, right? And there's nothing you can't build out of that. Once you retreat completely into the self, you're not going to be able to build out. So yeah, I think building community is one of the most important things that we need to be doing, especially now. I think that there's been some really great conversations that people are starting to have about the internet that aren't just like, oh, well, technology is bad because, in the old days, we used to write letters instead of email, like a kind of like stupid, parochial view of the problem with the internet, instead of like the actual problem of these technologies is that they are meant to turn you into one, like you're creating a vision of yourself online that's completely separate from who you are. So you have an alienation from like your digital product, in the same sense you have an alienation from your work. And then two, it's meant to keep you online. It's meant to keep you from seeking out those public spaces. And I think it's really important that we build those. And towards the end of this talk, I'm going to start talking about populism a little bit, specifically the historical, like really existing populism of the United States, and how crucial social organizing was to it, which I think is like a really important lesson now as we're trying to get away from left pessimism and like neoliberal individualism. Understanding that building community, having compassion, having those basic social skills is like, it's funny sometimes to say it out loud because it sounds so obvious, but like that's something that we really have to be focusing a lot more on. Jeff Hamilton says, the entire TMBS crew is the best. Keep it up, Dave. Thanks so much. I really appreciate all the support. And seriously, these super chats are really helpful for us in keeping this YouTube channel viable, because we put a lot of work and effort into it. Yeah, okay. I'm trying to read through a few of these questions here on the chat. I'm sorry, I'm reading one of the questions right now. I'm sorry, DC, if you want to try that again. I'm sort of was having a little bit of trouble finding the question there. But yeah, I think that I think we can jump into the populism thing. So like American populism is, I think, the model, or at least a model of what we need to be building. Remember, these social movements were being built at the end of the 19th century, so the late 1800s. So this was the beginning of a strong union movement, a strong union movement, and the beginning of what were called the farmers' alliances, which were actual like coalitions of farmers who were basically being taken advantage of across the entire South and Midwest by merchants, because the merchants were basically able to get things on credit because there's a currency crisis in the United States. People didn't really have access to hard currency, so they would sell off the future rights to their crops. And basically this created a debt system. so this created a debt system that basically people could never get out of. They were constantly in debt to the merchants, and they would harvest their crops, and they would give it to the merchant, and then the merchant would say, okay, we still owe me, $5 or whatever, which would be a lot back then. And then, well, the farmer's like, well, I'll have to buy seed and equipment for the next year, so they would just add it on to the next year until these debts just got, ridiculous. And what happened was eventually enough farmers got together, and by the way, black and white, and that's the thing that's really exceptional about the American populist movement, is it was doing the work that people talk about wanting to do today, and it was doing it just in the context of everybody looking out for their interest and their community's interests, right? Because it was very clear the political and economic classes that had developed at that point. So they built these alliances where they were able to issue credit, they were able to buy in bulk, and then they were eventually able to sell in bulk. And these became first economic alliances that then became political alliances. And they existed because people had social spaces. The alliances, they actually started paying people, farmers who were very militant, very, very important members of the movement. They started paying them to basically just become full-time provocateurs and travel from town to town and to turn this town into an alliance town and that town to an alliance town. And it really grew exponentially. It really started in Texas, and then it went across the entire South. And that's like the real populism, because the way that people talk about populism today is very different from the historical, the actual historical reality of what populism was. So those were all based on, a real social movement that neoliberalism really has destroyed. Neoliberalism it's a big, it's a word that comes in with a lot of baggage, but you got to understand it as a political system that one is trying to commodify and privatize everything, and two, socially, is trying to turn us all into individuals and to destroy any idea of society. You got to think about socialism in this sense. It's actually socialism really being a collective mentality. Versus neoliberalism, which is all about individualism. And we're still stuck in that cultural ideology of neoliberalism, and we have to do a lot of work. And we'll have to do a lot of work on trying to rebuild these. So I have a couple super chats here. Lily says, "Rest in power." Selena Reyes Hernandez and Sarah Higazi. Will you talk to the rest of TMBS team? Segment on them. Love the Griscom streams. Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely pass that along. And Greg, hey man, I appreciate everything, and I appreciate that you love that you're enjoying the work. So, let's see. So we have this fundamental issue with left pessimism, which is ideology that retreats to the individual self. It's born out of a genuine caring about people in the world around you, but it becomes very anti-human because you start to just see everybody as pure, like, neoliberal subjects, and you start to give up at any possibility of like real meaningful organizing. And then that comes out of neoliberalism, which is the social project of capitalism, of modern capitalism, which is about destroying any kind of idea of the collective, any kind of sense of the community, right? And that's the root of left pessimism. Left pessimism could only exist under the context of international neoliberalism. And now we're comparing that with the actual existing populism, which united people of very different cultures, race and communities, and across an agrarian South and Midwest, but also a very large part of the country that was also was a very different culturally, from South Carolina to Texas to Kansas to Alabama, right? These are very different places, and anyone who's from there will understand what I mean. So like the actual hopeful model that we have is like early American populism was able to break from a kind of individualistic, even like farming, right? Small time farming, you would think is such like a private affair, right? Because it's families, small families. They're not going to a factory floor, and that's why I think that it is such an inspiring and interesting example. Because a lot of people say, "Oh, we can't do politics we used to because we don't all go to the factory," and that's definitely true, and that's definitely a part of neoliberalism. But we have examples in the United States where when people were, living very rural, in sparsely populated areas were actually able to build political movements that were able to transcend them. And I think that we can do that again. And again, I'm not saying that the American populist movement is like what our model needs to be. It's specifically a couple of takeaways. One, that organizing around very specific economic and class issues that people were experiencing was a great way to bring people into larger political organizations that then were able to focus on a lot of different political problems. In the same way that when we were talking about earlier, defund the police, right? People say, I want to do something about police brutality. Then you say, defund the police, give money to schools, do all of these other things, right? That's like the kind of politics I think we need to be seeing more of. And two, that you need to understand that this was a successful movement, a successful, on some levels, third-party movement, or like one of the most successful that we've had, because it was so rooted in the community, in the social organizations. It wasn't like a kind of cultural choice. It was literally, we need to do this to survive. And I think we need to start thinking strategically about how could we build something like that. Now, obviously, we don't have the same problems as folks like back then did, but, think about something like rent. Like the majority of Americans are rent burdened. Trying to find a way to turn the American renter into a political economic class, that could have a lot of opportunity, and people are organizing around that. I just think, focusing on that, like that could be like the seeds that we need to focus on. So Crazy Musician says, do you see the internet as a driver of this left pessimism? I do, but I also think that it comes out of, yes, I think that left pessimism is definitely fueled by the internet. I think that neoliberalism has done a really good job at utilizing internet and specifically social networks, social media, to drive us to be kind of individualistic instead of social in our political orientations. But I think that you start to see this in the 80s and 90s. This is kind of like, there was a period, and this is before my time. I'm a 90s kid, but in the 80s and 90s were like the American left. They had given up socialism as a political ideology, and then there was this kind of like anti-consumer, like anarchism, like, okay, it's against big systems, and it's like we need to return to the local, right? And you don't know a lot about those movements unless you live through them, because they weren't particularly successful. People did a lot of work, and then I'm not trying to dog anybody. We're all trying to make the world a better place, but right, that really turned like your own individual choices as like, oh, I don't buy that, oh, I don't participate in that, I don't have a TV, right, kind of idea. Like left pessimism exists then too. So it's not necessarily a product of the internet specifically, but the internet plays a big role in like building that kind of individualism. Dante is just trying to roast everybody, I think, and he says, curious who at TMBS is the most multilingual. I don't know if Matt or Michael mess around. I think that Matt might have done a little bit of French, and I have some very broken and poor Spanish. I don't know about Michael specifically. It's always something I wish I was a little bit stronger in Spanish than I am, but so that's actually like something that's one of my goals over the next period of time, because I think we got to build that connection between the United States left and Central and South America. But I will say, just in the spirit of your question, I also have a difficulty with Spanish because I've had so many different Spanish teachers, specifically in my public high school. I had some, very fluent native speakers, and I had some others who I would assume were fluent since they're Spanish teachers, but they had like really thick Southern accents. So I remember one of my Spanish teachers would always be like, "¿Cómo estás?" So my Spanish is like, there's a problem of both, vocabulary and pronunciation because of that too. So let's see. We have some interesting questions here in the chat. Let me jump in. Somebody asked something about hegemony here. Oh, where did it go? What happens to the United States economy and politics if hegemony declines, China rises, and 90s globalization is replaced by these bilateral trade agreements? And that's from a trashy Zach Braff. I think so the question is, what's going to happen to the United States economy, basically, with the rise of China? And I think that the bigger question that hits at is sort of what is the crisis of global capitalism right now, and China's changing their economy. They're no longer just being the cheap labor source for the global economy. China is just rapidly modernizing, and there's a shift there too. I mean, it's such a big country, and there's so much development that happened that it's still going to have a strong industrial base for a long time. But you're starting to see the shifts into something that looks a little bit more like a European or Western, or an American economy. By that I mean, higher skilled jobs, tech, and service economy. And Aaron Brenoff had a really interesting two-part piece in, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Aaron. I apologize if I got it wrong, but a really interesting two-part piece in the New Left Review, I believe, in December and January, basically about the shifts in global capitalism, where a lot of people argue, like the Yang, contended, for example, that like we're seeing this massive automation, and that's why we're seeing like lower wages for workers, when really there's a couple of narratives. The first is that, like, yes, there was a lot of offshoring, but two, that we're actually reaching a point of like overcapacity in our production. And what that means is, like, if you produce too much, then the prices start to collapse. And when the prices start to collapse, then the amount of profit that the capitalist can make, right? Because that's the rate of exploitation between the labor that the worker puts in, right, and then the final sale price, right? Like that, the profit is the space between like what you have to pay the worker, the final price, and then that's the profit that the capitalist gets. When prices fall, the amount of profit for the capitalist starts to squeeze and get smaller. And because they're only in it to make money, that is when they start to do things like exploit their workers more. If they try to pay them less, they try to make them work more, or they go to other countries where they can, exploit at a higher rate. The problem of overcapacity is that we're actually starting to reach a point of such overcapacity that there's really not as much space for capitalists to find areas to squeeze as much as they need to make that activity profitable for them. Now, if we weren't living in a capital system, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But anyway, that's a really great piece to check out. So the shifts that we're starting to see as China becomes, this very important economic player, it's going to be in the context of, yes, dealing with the United States on a multipolar level, but also in a context of capitalism having a very difficult time being an overly profitable system. So that's going to make a huge that's going to be a huge development over the next few years. So let's see. Some people, I think, trolls about communism in the chat, anti-communist. I mean, I love all my good commie chat warriors. Let's see if I have any more questions before I'm gonna try to go to some of these marches today. If anyone has any questions, like, please jump in. But just in the meantime, so the real big lessons that like I want to hit at today is left pessimism's got to go. It's a tired ideology, and it's an ideology that comes from our enemies. We need to have a politics that's really about building a power and that believes in people and doesn't retreat into your own individual, purely into like your own individualism. And I think that that's like something that we're having a really difficult time with right now, without having. Actually, you know what? I was thinking about this before I came on before I did the stream, and I want to use this as an example of left pessimism. We need to stop thinking that the problem with politics is that we haven't created the right set of words, like the right argument. And that, that's going to solve the problem of capitalism and capitalist realism. That's not the solution. The solution literally is going to be building those connections between people, building those organizations, and understand and having them operate in a way that we're not only thinking as individuals, we're thinking as a group. And that's why I bring up those really interesting examples from the American populist movement, because you had a large group of farmers who were being exploited. And because they were thinking and they were saying, these are the problems we face, like, how can we work our way out of it? They were able to think as a collective group to find solutions to their problems that were very creative and novel, right? They created all of these organizations that had never existed before, right? Because they were thinking as a class. And that's the kind of shift that I think we need to start getting into. Don't get me wrong. Literally, like I do this, like this is what I do, right? I talk and I write, and I think I'm not saying that we shouldn't be thinking and writing and arguing. Those are really important, but they only become meaningful when we start to build and act on those. That's how we start to implement the strategies, and really how we can actually cultivate a real strong analysis of the world, because there's only so much we can do on an individual level. And at a certain point, if you're just sitting around thinking about everything, you're just watching the world go around you. You got to think, like, be a thinker and an actor, like Lenin or Che, like all those folks. Like Fanon, I think, is a great example of this. Fanon's written some of the most crucial books of theory, and he literally, was a fighter and fought, and fought for a free Algeria, right? Like, that's the kind of praxis that we need to be building. So let's see. Terene Zahari, I really apologize if I mispronounced your name. I have most of my good friends are Iranians, so I do think I think that the left in this country really needs to care a lot more about human rights in Iran, and I hope that we can start focusing on that a lot more. I think people really need to be, specifically in the United States context, really recognizing the devastation that sanctions are doing, and really understand that on a political level, with the idea of changing, instead of just putting on another list of bad things that the United States does. We need to put the pressure to end our stuff. Daniel Ocean says American Iranians like to refer to themselves as Persian. Well, that might be your opinion, but that's not always true, right? That's actually quite fraught, because Persian denotes a different group, while Iranian denotes a lot of different ethnic groups. So at least people that I'm around, they prefer to be called Iranian versus Persian, because Persian's a very specific person and history. But anyways, I'm not the expert, not trying to jump on anybody. But yeah, so let me see if we could get any more questions. I'd be happy to answer them. We're going to be heading out in a second. Mutineer says, one thing that inspires me, if you see this protest, who are leading them? Women. I tell you, revolutions happen when women are pissed off. I mean, look, these movements are very organic, and you're going to see very organic people leading it, which is a beautiful thing. Which means it's going to be women, it's going to be a lot of different folks, and that's something that's so important. And it's beautiful to me, I guess, is because it's not contrived. It's literally this is the natural way that it's going to happen, right? Because there's the people rising up, rather than some kind of PR strategy or whatever. Greg said, we should understand the amount of genocide the Iranian people have gone through as well. I agree. And I agree with you also, Zohadi. The left never points out the human rights violations within Iran. I think so too. I think a lot of people are a little bit too afraid to jump into it, because they don't understand what's going on, and because there's so many people like Tom Cotton and stuff like that who use it as a political weapon. But I think that people should be very clear about what kind of government and system exists there. I think that you're absolutely right. I think the left actually should do a lot of growing on that, because you need to have the analysis and the ability to be able to understand the multifaceted nature of countries, instead of just saying oh, this is the kind of thing that Republicans say, so I'm never going to acknowledge that, right? Don't let them own that. That's how you give them space. That is quite dangerous. So I think that's actually a really important point. New protest placard, Cornel West for VP or removal. Yeah, that'd be pretty hilarious. I don't know if Cornel West would run Joe Biden. I couldn't imagine that. Oh, I like that, Tommy. Tommy says, being pessimistic is a consequence of seeing what is happening in the world. Being a socialist involves seeing the overlooked problems. I mean, look, that's the point about left pessimism I'm saying, is that it comes from a very genuine and human, in a human place of actually saying the world's messed up and I'm devastated that nobody's doing anything about it, right? Like, I understand that. I feel that all the time, like there's so much pain and horror in history, and specifically American history. It's like, it can be really overwhelming. But the left pessimism misdirects that feeling, instead of using that as a feeling for change or to build a hopeful and a better future, into like hating people. And I think that that's really the problem, because not only is it bad personally, it's obviously very bad politically, because you ostracize yourself, you alienate yourself, and you're not going to be able to build the kind of political movements that we need. We have a nice chat here from Julie Tully. Tell your friends, many of us think of them daily. Free Palestine as well. Thank you for your hard work. Absolutely, free Palestine. That's been another beautiful thing, is to see the solidarity. I haven't been to a march yet where I haven't seen a Free Palestine, flag. That's the kind of way that we're going to be able to build these movements, focusing on what our specific goals are and our specific demands are, but really building that picture so people understand that these are global systems. And specifically when it comes to Palestine, that's actually not even too abstractly related to the American police system, since a lot of American police are trained in their tactics in Israel. So that's actually a direct line as well. Alejandro Cisneros. We aren't either supplier or demander. We are both suppliers and demanders at the same time. Don't let neoliberals pigeonhole you into either camp. Yeah. Zach Mills. When will the left get on board with reparations for Black descendants of U.S. slavery? A kind of true solidarity then is desperately needed. I think that it's definitely something that I think it's a very important and radical demand. I think, there's been a lot of interesting debate about what that potentially means and sort of the pitfalls of that. Adolph Reed has a pretty interesting debate with Kianga Yamada Taylor, actually, that you can listen to those on NPR. And, I think that, we have to think about how we're going to build, a society that's able to rectify the immense debt that it owes to so many people, specifically, to the descendants of, slaves in the United States, Native American peoples. I think that we need to build a politics that recognizes those debts and also recognizes that we can try to make steps, but we're never going to be able to rectify the past. We're really going to have to build a very just and equitable future. So yeah, I think Hummingbird, pessimism does not equal realism. I think that's exactly it. I think that's exactly what we need to be building. And let me see. I think that I'd like to do this again sometime soon with y'all. I really appreciate being able to work through these ideas. Feel free to hit me up on all of the platforms I'm on. I'm on Twitter, Facebook. I think I'm trying to get off of Facebook, honestly. It's too much nonsense on there for me. Plus my Facebook ads have gone really weird, right-wing stuff like bot armor and things like that. Makes me too depressed to go on there. And then you can always email me questions too. I really love conversing with everybody. This is something we're building together, and I think things are real tough right now. But we're making the moves that need to happen, and you never know what's possible. We have to have the belief that everything's possible. And happy Juneteenth, everybody. We got another show on Tuesday. Check out some of our conversations. If you're not a patron, I highly suggest jumping on. Thanks to everybody for the super chats. There's going to be a talk tomorrow, a clip that we did for the post game tomorrow that I think will be really nice. I really like that we did Michael, Daniel, and I on technocracy, global ID, and I started to talk about sort of the issues surrounding the mask, not necessarily wearing the mask, but making sure that we're not falling into a trap of sort of accepting everything that we're told to do. So definitely check that out if you're interested. And thank you all so much. Take care.